Healing Coalition, by 1926, nearly 83% of Indian school-aged children were attending boarding schools. In 1900, there were an estimated 20,000 Native children in federal boarding schools, but in only 25 years, that number had more than tripled to nearly 70,000. So Shan Goshorn's basket, shrouded in gray, which is currently on view at Gilcrease Museum, is one of several pieces that address the long and often painful history of the Indian boarding school system. With this basket, Goshorn stated that she wanted to confront the viewer with the fact that the history of colonial and indigenous relationships is one tainted by genocidal policies. She pointed out that genocide does not only refer to the physical extermination of a group of people, but also of their social, cultural, economic, biological, and spiritual well-being. Shrouded in Gray emphasizes the fact that the founding of Indian boarding schools in the United States was not an anomalous or a one-off event, but was in fact part of a much larger historical and political system of fixing the quote unquote Indian problem. This single weave basket combines text from 3 documents that highlight the genocidal history of US Indigenous relations. One is the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which displaced an estimated 100,000 Native people from their homelands. The second is the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867, which relocated several Plains tribes to reservations and substantially diminished their rightful claims to their ancestral lands. And the third is a roster of children from the Carlisle Indian Boarding School, an institute that long served as the prototype for federal Indian schools across the country. Goshorn wanted her viewers to acknowledge this history and the still extant traumas associated with boarding schools, which is a topic that many still find difficult to discuss. But that is what we're here today to do, is to discuss these realities. So our first question is for all of the panelists. Feel free to weigh in. I'd like to know, why is it important for Indigenous communities to share these stories? Why is it significant to have panel discussions like this one that provide a safe forum to talk about the history of boarding schools?
Yep, go ahead. I want to comment on that one. I know that our children do not know these stories, and even my own children, they don't know. And when I teach the language, I have to always put this in there, how I learned English. And I've heard some people ask me, did you really go to boarding school? Did you really go? And, you know, I would think to myself, you've never heard of this? You know, and I'm thinking, well, so I would relate my story. And it kind of surprises me, I guess, because there's a lot of people that I know that I went to school with. They're still living, but they will not share their stories. They will not talk about it. There's too much pain. And I know they still speak the language. And there's times that they would say, why should we tell our stories? Nobody wants to know. Nobody cared. But I tell them that the younger generation needs to know what the elders went through. That's the reason that our language is not so common anymore. But that's what I say when I am asked to teach a language, or I always have to put that in there, because that's, to me, that's important, to share the story, to let people know that, you know, the reason for the language is not so common anymore. We almost lost it because we were forced to learn English. You know, the funny thing is, well, it's not really funny, but in the school, we were beaten if we were caught speaking the language. And we were afraid, very afraid, to even utter a word because we might say it in our native language. And so we go through school and we finally get to go home. We get in trouble for speaking English. Our grandmother says, do not speak that. Of course, she's speaking in a native language. And she says, I am not white, so you do not speak to me in that language. You only speak the language that the good Lord gave you. And so, and she says, don't you ever, ever forget your language. She says, no matter what happens to you, do not forget. So thereby, I still speak it today.
Thank you.
I think to add to that, spiritually, there's a lot of power in our words. And I think having sovereignty over our narratives is important. Oftentimes, history in the school system is taught from the perspective of the colonizer, which just perpetuates coloniality. And look at the favors that the United States has done for Native peoples. Look at, you know, how we have civilized you. These are the types of narratives that are told. And being able to share our own stories provides healing. It provides healing for the individuals sharing the stories, but it provides opportunities for community healing if it's shared in open spaces. Our stories are the ways that we really share our values, our resilience, and they are our survivance. And it is so important that we continue to talk about these things. I think to go along with what Melissa was saying, I grew up knowing about Indian boarding schools, and I was working in an inpatient hospital setting and was in San Diego and was told that this person had come from boarding school. And I was like, wait, tell me more about this. And I didn't realize boarding school has a different sort of connotation and socioeconomic status and things for people currently who aren't Native, and that's a very different thing. And so I didn't have some of that history, but I realized that nobody I was working with understood what I heard when I heard the term boarding schools and what that sort of elicited for me as well. So we need to keep sharing these histories.
I mean, if I can just add to that, I want to say, you know, first of all, I think I'm looking at the chat and I'm seeing that a lot of people who are with us actually have experiences as boarding school survivors themselves, or they've had either a parent or a grandparent. So I just want to say that I know these conversations are really, really, really difficult for people to have. And if you're here and you're finding yourself having a hard time, you know, just to remind yourself that it's okay to get up from the computer. It's okay to take a breath. It's okay to go walk around for a little while and come back to it, to just do what you need to do to take care of yourself today too, because these conversations are, they're challenging. But I just want to add to that. I think, you know, I did not know that my grandfather was in a boarding school. He was at Holy Childhood in Michigan. And I think we had all sort of skirted around the conversation, if that makes sense. I mean, obviously he's Native, but part of the reason I think it's so important what Melissa said about telling the story, about remembering, especially for the younger generation, is that the younger generation needs to understand what was lost so that we understand the importance of maintaining it going forward. And I think that, you know, for me, that's been sort of the biggest impact of, you know, not only just the historical trauma aspect of it and thinking about what my grandfather went through, what his siblings went through, what his mother went through, and so on and so forth down our line. But just thinking about the fact that when I saw my grandfather's name on the 1920 census roll for that school, it said that he was 8 years old, and it said that he did not speak English or write in English. So that means that my grandfather spoke Anishinaabemowin completely, and that I myself only speak like 3 words of it. You know, and I think I think it's very important to remember, like, these schools were very successful in what they sought to do in terms of assimilation, in terms of cultural genocide. But also just for the younger generation, it impresses upon us that we really need to focus on learning our language, to take advantage of the fact that we do still have access to our elders, and to focus on, like Dr. Melissa Teehee said, survivance, because that's a big piece of that.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think it's even, more important right now when a lot of our communities and our elders are even in a little bit more danger due to the global health crisis right now, that the more that we can share our stories and the more that we can honor them and do our part to help protect them becomes all the more pertinent right now. Thank you. So this second question is, again, for all of the panelists. How has the structure of boarding schools across multiple eras of history impacted Indigenous communities across generations? So what are those intergenerational impacts that we see in boarding school history?
I mean, I can start just because I'll just keep going. I'll just keep rambling, everybody. So loss of language is probably number one, right? So I think it's important to think about the ways in, like, the types of trauma that were inflicted during the boarding school era and sort of across colonialism and genocide as it has continued and is still continuing today, right? You can think about it in terms of, these were the individual experiences of students who had attended at the hands of the individuals who ran their schools, right? So you see things like sexual violence, physical abuse, homicide in some instances, suicide, those pieces, right? And that's trauma in its own way, obviously. And then there's the trauma, the systemic harm, the state violence, the state action, right? Which is the cultural genocide. And that harm has continued to perpetuate itself as well. And that is what is historical, that is what is ongoing, and that is what is passed down from generation to generation. My grandfather's trauma is my trauma, it lives inside of me. And I think that when we don't sort of separate it out, it's easy to look at it, particularly in my grandfather's instance, where it was a Catholic boarding school. It's so easy to look at it as, oh, it was a Catholic school and that was, sexual abuse was rampant at certain Catholic institutions, and that was just sort of occurring. And that is true, that is true. But it was not true, right, that the federal government was forcibly removing everybody in the way that they were removing Indian children specifically for the purpose, like the sole purpose of making them not Indian. That to me speaks to all of that kind of layered trauma that comes in. And I think that if there's one thing that people walk away with today, right, it should be that this was state violence. This was a part of a colonial system, and we have to think about it in terms of that. But the resulting harm is just something that's ongoing, and it's the lived experience of most natives that you'll talk to.
This is Melissa. This is so true. What she said is true. I know that being a full blood and seeing and remembering the attitude of non-natives toward children that couldn't speak English, even in the boarding school. I mean, I wasn't alone. My sisters and I weren't alone. There was others all around us that couldn't speak English, and it was just so sad. When I see on TV, when I watch movies like the military, where they're all they show where their new recruits are enlisted and they're standing in line getting their clothes, they're in their underwear, they're all in line. That's the way we were. where children were only 6 years old, and we're in our little girls, we're in our panties, and we have our arms extended, waiting to get our clothes, government issued clothes. And when I see that on TV, I think that's the way we were. And, you know, and it also shows the military getting up a certain time, they're being awakened, or a bell or something. That's the way we were. It was all military style. I used to think someday this will end, or someone should intervene right now. If a child didn't get out of bed, you know, the matron would come in and throw them out of bed and say, hey, it's time for you to get up. If you can't get up, I'll get you up. And so much that I see on movies or TVs about the military, that was done to, you know, little children. But I used to think, surely someone's going to come in and intervene and stop all of this. But that didn't happen until years later. And so when I hear about DHS and coming in on the family because something is going bad, or the kids are being abused, you know, and I'm thinking, why didn't this happen back then? Because, you know, children were being abused. Nobody cared. But, you know, the thing I saw when I remember the matrons, they were speakers too of their own language. But I guess they were doing it for money to teach the children the language, the English language, and use force. But when they're alone, I could hear them speaking their native language, whether it be Choctaw or Chickasaw or Cherokee. And I thought, the government is using Indian against Indian. I thought, that's not fair. But then as I grew older, I realized that history was being repeated. You know, this happened back then, you know, when the wars back in the 1800s, they used they called the friendly Creeks against the Red Stick warriors. So, you know, it wasn't, it was just history being repeated all over again.
There's some questions in the chat about how long the boarding schools went. And, you know, a lot of them closed in the 50s. But the one closest to me, where I'm at here in northern Utah, closed in 1984. So you think about the civil rights era, you think about these things happening in the 60s and the 70s, and these boarding schools are continuing. And I think, you know, there's been talk about sort of the loss of language, and there's some things in the chat as well. And these are things that were taken from us. And it's hard to attend to getting language back when a lot of times the schools and things are not currently run by tribes. And so it's just very, very difficult. And there is a fear still in school. There are a lot of people that are around my age or a little younger that are likely a first generation college student because of the damage that the education system has done to Native peoples and to our culture. And so I think when you ask sort of what is the history of this going across generations, it has been harmful to generation after generation long enough that it is hard to regain some of the things that were taken from us.
Absolutely. And I want to underline too that, you know, we keep talking about the loss or the taking away of ancestral languages, and that for a lot of Native communities, language is not simply a means of communication, but our languages actually often encapsulate our entire worldviews, right? Like our languages are very relational, and they say a lot. There's so much that you can say in just a few words, right? Especially compared to English. And that when that starts to go away, that starts to erode, you're not just losing your means of communicating, the literal language, but you're also losing a lot of that knowledge that has been passed down through those languages. Our stories and our belief systems and what we know about ourselves and about creation is embedded in those very words. So it's a much more I guess complex and layered loss. And then there was a going back to that question about when did boarding schools kind of cease operating, that's a complicated question because many of them haven't. But I'd like to clarify that they're really through the 60s and the 70s, like Dr. Teehee pointed out, many boarding schools, some of which still receive federal funds, like the one that I'm familiar with is Sherman in Riverside, California, in the 70s was essentially handed over to a group of tribes local to California to operate. And so even though it's still technically considered a federal boarding school because they receive federal funds, the day-to-day operations are no longer administered by missionaries or by federal agents, but by a group of Native people who came together and said, this needs to stop, right? This is how we need to repair some of the damage that has been done. So yes, many of them closed, but many operate in very different ways than the way they operated when they were founded. So I think that's important to remember here.
You know, I want to second that too. I think the you know, I read this book that I'm sure most of you have read on this call, and I'm sure everybody that's an attendee has heard of it, but Braiding Sweetgrass, right? By Robin Kimmerer. And if you haven't read it, I suggest it. She talks about our languages from the tribes of Michigan. And she talked about the word abe, which I'm going to mispronounce it entirely, but it's Wigwema, which actually doesn't mean bay, it means to be a bay. Right. And so the relational aspect of our language to our worldview is really important, because when I think about the word bay in English, like a body of water that is a bay, I think about it as something that is not animate. Right. I don't think of it as something that chose to be a bay in that moment. And there's a value that's transmitted there. That has to do with the way that we treat land, the way that we treat earth, the way that we treat water, and our animal kinship and our kinship with one another. And when you disrupt that language, and when you take something like that, you steal a worldview. And that itself has led, I think, to a lot of, you know, and most people would agree about this, it's not my original thought, has led to a lot of intergenerational trauma in our communities, just the simple like inversion of our values.
Right. And you know, one of the things that was really prominent in these kind of, not thinking about the way that a lot of boarding schools are operating at this moment, but the way that they have historically operated, was for teachers and missionaries to teach students that those knowledge systems and their worldviews were inferior, right? It's not simply a switch to a different worldview, but it's an actual decimation and degradation of everything that you know. And instead we're supposed to be taught how to function, right, as successful members of American society. And I'm wondering if Melissa Harjo-Maffer, if you can talk a little bit about those effects of breaking down someone's entire worldview. How does that undermine our kinship structures in Native American communities, especially related to that passing of intergenerational knowledge from one generation to the next? What kind of effects did boarding schools have on that?
in the boarding school, you know, it was so different from what we were taught at home. At home, we were taught to not look at an adult, you know, in the eyes. Don't look at the face. And so when we were in boarding school, I was taught to look at the teacher in the face. We weren't taught that. That was very disrespectful at home. And it was, you know, it was so different. So when we went home and grandmother starts talking, we had to remember we don't look at her. And I know our parents were watching us to see how we had changed. So my sisters and I would talk, you know, when we go home, we have to unlearn what we learned at the boarding school. Go back home, we are home, we remember what we were taught at home. So we didn't look at our parents or our grandmother when she spoke. We looked down, we listened. And I realized later on in life that children do listen better if they may be playing with the ball, just barely maybe touching it, kind of rolling it, but they're listening. And so children are like that. And that's the way I was. I remember real well. But we never looked at an adult in the eyes. We never did. But in the boarding school, we were taught that. Then I remember also when we first got to boarding school, the matron, she was a big, heavy-set woman. And she says to us while we're all standing in line, several of us, you know, and she says, she walks back and forth in front of us, you know, just like an officer would do, the military guys. And she says, I am your mother. You are to listen to me. Of course, at the time, I didn't know what she was saying, but my sister was interpreting for me. And I'm thinking, she's not our mother. And, you know, she was really abusive. If anyone spoke up out of turn, they were slapped. And, or if they happened to forget an English word, you know, they said it in the language, they were slapped. And I was so scared to death. I just didn't want to say anything. I just stand at attention, I guess you call it. And, but they, you know, they were out to teach us the dominant society's way of life. And we had to abide by every rule that they put out. So to survive there. But when we were finally sent home or taken home, we relaxed. We were back to our old self and back to the way of life for us. But in the boarding school, it was like stepping on eggshells or trying not to break the shell, you know, mind your P's and Q's. But we weren't like that at home. But we were more respectful at home. And the way that the matrons acted toward us, it was just so, to us, disrespecting, because adults back home didn't act like that. And it was just, I don't know, I couldn't even describe the word for it. We were just really, really not, we're thinking, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? And sometimes I used to wonder if my mother was threatened. And if, you know, if she said no to the social worker that came to the house. And I would always wondered what would have happened to her. Would they have not let us come home? But I always think somehow, but she never did say. I always wondered though. I'm thinking sometimes that she was threatened, and but our lifestyle at the schools was really just so different. Everything we learned at home was not good for them, but we knew deep down that when we go home, we had to like change our color. We're white at the school, but when we went home, we had to be our native person. And so it was like kind of living in two worlds. And, but no matter what they said about our way of life, it was wrong, they said. You weren't supposed to do that, or you're not supposed to do, you know, we remembered what grandmother said. No matter what happens to you, you don't forget who you are. She used to tell us that. So it was kind of like they telling us, went through one ear and out the other, because when we go home, we're going to be happy. We're going to be who we really are. Of course, in the ways of our people, you know, we were always reminded when we go home that this is the way it was, this is the way it always will be. As long as you're Istijati, they said. Istijati means a red person. So we had to remember that. We always had to remember our language. We had to remember who we are. And no matter how much beating we got, we were going to remember who we were. And we were not to ever forget our way of life, the way we were taught, you know, being respectful to the elders, not speaking out of turn, don't ask questions. In the classroom at the boarding school, you know, they used to want us to ask questions. Well, we were taught not to do that. So, and then they would get after us because we wouldn't speak up, but we were taught not to do that. We were not to speak out of turn. And, but it was just just really, really an eye-opening, I guess, for us to know that their way of life was totally different from ours. But the thing you'd always remember is when the matron says, I am your mother now. I thought, oh my goodness, you know, that can't be my mother. And everything that they taught us though, like in home life, sewing, we enjoyed that. Of course, mother had an old sewing machine, the old pedal kind. We used to try to learn how to use that. But they taught us, you know, the things that we needed to learn to survive, you know, the work of the woman in the home. We did a lot of cleaning. My sister used to say, I bet that building has never been cleaner since then, since we were there. She said, I remember cleaning the bathroom floors with a toothbrush, she said. And I said, I know. And I said, the windows really sparkled when I got through, I said. So we really were taught to clean and clean. And you know, today I do have a clean home. My sisters and brothers, they were kind of afraid to come to my house. You know, they said, your house is too clean. But, you know, that's one thing I learned at the school. A good thing, I guess. Of course, I'm not saying we didn't live like that. We did. But it was just little things like that. Of course, they didn't teach us how to cook. Grandma taught us that. And we love the traditional cooking. And the ways of our people was something that we always had to remember. No matter how much beatings we might have got or how much abuse we received from the school. And I know not everyone had grandparents or grandmother like I did, because she was the one wanting us to keep the way. She says, this is who you are. The good Lord made you who you are. If you were to be another color or to speak another language, that would have been so when you were born. And it was, to us, that made sense. And no matter what we were told that our traditional way of life was wrong, you know, we didn't want to believe that. And we didn't, because we knew we was going to face grandmother, and we loved her. We loved her more than the matrons at the school, you know. And of course, in a way, we were afraid of grandmother, you know, because she always had that willow switch, you know. But still, you know, we loved her. We would rather take that from her than to take the abuse from the matrons at the school, you know. But the ways that they taught us, the good ways was good, that sewing and cleaning and so forth. But some of the ways I didn't agree, and my sisters and I, we would sneak off and we would talk in the language, and she'd say, remember what grandma said now, remember. And we knew we was going to see grandma again, you know, and she would ask us, what did y'all learn? But, you know, she'd always say, you got to remember who you are, remember who you are. So although they tried to tell us and teach us that our traditional way of life was not good or not the right way, all we could do was just nod our head or say, okay. But deep down, we knew that we weren't going to acknowledge their teachings, you know, because we knew who we were and we were taught that. I remember grandmother used to always say, always remember your clan, always remember your tribal town. Our tribal town is Corsadi. And so Corsadi people always stuck together, and their way of life, their language, you know, that's who we were. And I hear other people say, well, I'm Kelechi. Okay. But we were taught we're Corsadi. I didn't know any other tribal town except Corsadi. And we all knew that we were from the Bird Clan. And so when the other students at the school would talk about their way of life, we'd sneak off and we would talk, we would share. And they would tell us, and we realized that a lot of our ways were similar. And so we would share, but we always tried to make sure we didn't get caught talking about stuff like that, because we weren't supposed to talk like that, you know. And so hiding and talking and sharing was a way of just communicating with other tribes, and knowing that what they taught us, what they said was bad, that didn't sink in for us. You know, it just wouldn't. And I'm glad I had a grandmother like that, a grandmother that really said that, you know, wanted us to stay who we are. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And no matter what happens to you, I guess it's kind of like a soldier in war. No matter what happens, you're going to come through somehow, some way, if you really, really are wanting to survive, you know. And so I'm glad today that I can still speak the language, and I try to teach my grandchildren. But with the high-tech things today, it's kind of hard to get their attention, you know. I'm saying, hey, I'm your grandma, and I want to teach you something. And it says, and they say, I say something to them in the language, they'll stop and look at me like, what'd you say? And then that's the only way I would get their attention though anymore, you know. But again, the teachers at the school, you know, no matter how hard they try to teach me and my siblings, it didn't, you know, it didn't work. Because being raised the way we were, you know, everything that grandmother said was true. What my mother said was true. Of course, my mother was sent to a boarding school also, and she learned English. That was the good part. She also spoke the language. And she had to learn English in order to read the letters for her mother. And we ended up doing the same thing. That was the good part. But we still remembered who we were. And my grandmother used to make fun of the language now and then, English. And she'd hear us talking now and then. And we knew we'd get in trouble for speaking English. So we would revert back to the Muskogee language, and she would laugh at us, and she'd tell us how silly we sounded speaking English. And today I think about that, and my brother, he comes up with some good ones, you know, and he'd say, when we say this is what we're saying in the language, or vice versa, you know. And so we have fun with it. But again, our ways of our grandparents, you know, no matter what was said, no matter how much punishment we got for it, it didn't change me, or it didn't change my siblings. You know, we're still who we are. But I know for others, they say they don't speak the language no more. They don't do this no more. They don't do that no more because they said it was wrong. It was wrong. And I said, well, you know, and another thing they taught us was going to school. And going to church. We went to school, we went to church, and they had the minister come to the church. And he would take us on little trips. And, you know, it was fun. And we would talk about different things. And I was just a good listener. I like to learn what the non-native has to talk about. And sometimes I'd go back and I'd tell my grandma what I heard or what I learned. And she would say, oh, that's Stehedke way, white man's way, you know. And she'd say, you just got to remember who you are. Stay that way. And she said, that's the way they live. You don't have to live like that. Or you don't have to believe like that. But, you know, again, a lot of the ways of our grandparents, you know, in me, it didn't change. But in others, it did, because I saw that. I saw, and I still see a lot of the, I won't say a lot, a few of the survivors from the same school that I attended. And we talk about things like that. But I can see the change in them. And we just share, you know, and sometimes they remember a certain thing that happened. And it's funny now, but it wasn't then. You know, we can laugh about it now. But again, our ways of our people is still with me. It may not be with a lot of the others, but it's still with me. Again, you know, I'm glad for my grandmother.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. We have a few minutes left. I'd like to get one more question in, and specifically for Dr. Teehee and Caroline. If both or either of you could describe a little bit some of the, because you're both involved in, especially in the advocacy side of advocating for survivors and kind of all realms, not just relating necessarily to boarding school trauma, but if you could talk about some of the modes of advocacy or some of the ways that Indigenous peoples now are trying to repair and come back maybe from those traumas that you see are happening right now. Try to end this on a little bit more of a positive note, right?
So, I mean, I think there's been a lot of questions in here too about what are some of the positives. And I think, you know, Melissa, thank you for sharing your experience. And I think the way you talk about it too, there's a lot of resilience there, and really like maintaining that cultural identity connection changes sort of how you were able to experience that. And I think a lot of us are currently trying to find that connection. And I find students who come into higher education that have a similar thing, that they don't know their language, right? And then they're told, there's often this, well, when I'm with Native people, I'm told I'm not Native enough. And when I'm with white people, like I'm told that I'm not white and I don't fit in, and I just don't feel like I fit in. And I think finding and having that cultural identity connection, you know, we have research that shows these things, but you can observe, it increases your self-esteem. It increases your optimism, like who you think you can be. And there's so much connection to that. And some of the amazing things that I see, so I don't do social media, and that's just a personal choice, but my students are finding these communities over social media too, in a way, and they're connecting in ways that they have not been able to connect before, that I didn't have the opportunity to. And so there's a whole like Native TikTok, that people are using to share culture and these strengths. And let's see, there's a picture behind me that one of my students and her daughters painted to really recognize the missing and murdered Indigenous women. And there are just all these ways that communities are coming together to heal and to bring awareness to a lot of issues that they just felt like they were sort of experiencing by themselves. And so I think there are just a lot of really cool ways people are connecting now.
You know, I think, you know, I mean, speaking to the advocacy piece of it, right, there's always different channels you can go through. And I think at the end, you guys will talk about some calls to action on some of this. You know, it's really how you frame it, right? I think it matters in terms of, are you looking at this as part of, you know, that like, of how are you truth telling around it, right? Are we having the real conversations? Are we educating other people? Are we talking to policymakers on these issues? How are we sharing these stories? Are people willing to share these stories? And so I think, you know, the advocacy kind of varies because unfortunately with Indian boarding school and the trauma that's related to it and ingrained in so many people, it's manifested in a lot of different issues. And so, you know, the advocacy itself spreads out. Like the MMIW connection is big for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. So is the domestic violence piece. And then I see a question here about Canada. I think they did a Truth and Reconciliation in Canada. So I know that has been helpful, right? But how many, you know, like I think about it from a human rights perspective too. So you've got, you know, you've got genocide and you have cultural genocide and the way that the UN defines those things, right? And then you have 4 countries. You've got New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the United States, all of whom opposed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which included in its early drafts pieces around assimilation and cultural genocide. And so what would the success of, you know, of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation, what is that going to look like going forward? How are they going to continue to do that? How would the US do it? Right, when we haven't ratified under yet. So, you know, thinking about those things, you know, we do talk about those in legal channels, but one of the ways that I think we heal, and Melissa Harjo said it earlier, is through humor. And Native people are funny. Like, we are funny. You guys need to make friends with Native people because we are lively. We tell stories in funny ways. You know, and I think that's how we deal with trauma. I see the other people on this call laughing because it's true. And sometimes that's deflecting, and then other times it's not, right? Other times it's genuine storytelling and genuine community with each other. And I think that's a big piece of how we're healing and moving forward.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think we see that humor coming through, especially going back. There's a lot of questions in the chat about what is Native TikTok. That is where you get to see a lot of this great Indian humor coming through, dealing with really heavy topics, right? But in short 60-second videos that are hilarious and incredibly relatable. So if you have TikTok, just start searching for Native content creators on there. Well, we are at time here, and I wish we could keep discussing, but we want to be sure that all of our attendees get to stay and watch the documentary. We are going to take a short break to kind of switch over to the film. But I just want to say, Yokoki, thank you again to all of our panelists and to everyone who attended. After the film, there will be our museum staff members, Danielle Culp especially, will be sharing resources on how you can further educate about this topic and how you can heal if this is something that is relevant to you and your family. So please stick around after the documentary as well. And again, thank you so much. This is a really great conversation. I'm so glad that we got to have it. So everyone, stick around for the documentary, and we hope to see you at more of our programs in the future.
We're here today for this panel and this filming. I want to thank you guys for taking your time to learn more about this. so that we can start these conversations that are so important about Indigenous history. I would like to take a moment to share with you guys that don't know that the Gilcrease Museum is sitting traditionally on Wajaje land and the Osage people, and we are currently a part of the Creek Nation jurisdiction. And we were originally started by a Muskogee Creek man named Thomas Gilcrease, and that's where this beautiful art collection started. I would like to introduce and thank for being a part of this program, one of our partners, which is the University of Tulsa Titan program. It is a trauma institute that is run out of the University of Tulsa. And one of our major partners and someone who's helped me work on this program has been Lisa Cromer. So I want to thank you so much, Lisa, for all the help that you have provided and for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me. It has been an honor and a privilege to be part of this. And I do want to start by saying the University of Tulsa actually started as the Presbyterian School for Indian Girls, and then later became the Henry Kendall College, and later after that, the University of Tulsa. And the University of Tulsa is currently working on a land acknowledgement, which hopefully will be available in the next year. So Melissa, we talked about how do we end something like this. And I think Gail Ross, the narrator, our storyteller, ended with such a positive note of strength and resilience. But there's a lot of people here probably wanting to have some sort of call to action. And so we talked about ending with some resources and generally a call to action. So a few resources to share for people who want to learn more. There is the Boarding School Healing Project. The link is there. And if you click on that link, they have resources for educators and for parents, for children from kindergarten all the way up to high school age. And the resources are absolutely wonderful. So these are made by, like, it is Native stories, and really, I think such an important piece in providing this information is who's in control of the narrative. At the very last page, so all the resources are the same, just developmentally different for different ages. The very last page has additional resources for more education. And so if you look there, there's a blog that you can follow for boarding school healing. There's a National Indian Education Association. People had mentioned in the chat the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation in Canada, and some additional resources as well. Also, I just wanted to mention NARF, the Native American Rights Foundation, which is a nonprofit legal organization. It is the largest and oldest legal organization for Native American rights. And so my guess is that if we're going to see any repatriations or compensations like we've seen in Canada, NARF would likely be who to connect with that. In terms of, you know, what the film didn't cover, and just also some language, I'm a psychologist, and I just want to talk for just a moment about language, some of the language used in terms of how Native American languages were lost, or how one of the people shared that they felt like they forgot. And, you know, in addition to some of this tragedy, we need to recognize a lot of Native languages are tonal languages, meaning that a child's brain loses the ability to hear different tones if they're not exposed to those languages. So it really speaks to the resilience of Native Indians that the languages are actually being so revitalized, because it's not just that languages aren't getting passed down, but the brain can actually lose the capacity to hear a language as they're meant to be, and why those oral traditions are so important. And so, you know, as we're thinking about how to respond and how to heal, one of the things, and Danielle, you're going to talk about ways of sharing stories. I just want to talk about, from a psychological perspective, what we've seen both from looking at the historical trauma and intergenerational trauma of Holocaust survivor families, as well as boarding school survivors, that the importance of sharing stories with strength-based narratives really has been showing that it helps with the next generation's connection to their culture. And so, you know, I'm personally torn as a psychologist because it's so critical that people choose to share their stories, but never be forced to share their stories. And so, you know, as we're thinking about creating avenues for additional healing and opportunities for storytelling, I just really want to share the importance of knowing that a shroud of silence, as it sometimes has been called, can actually has been shown in second and third generations to make kids feel more distant. And so as people like Melissa Harjo were sharing today, it's just so beneficial for the next generations to have that connection and hear those stories. And what we see in the healing literature is that when we have these narratives of heroes and strength and recognize the importance of the resilience that these programs, while they did cause incredible genocide of culture and of people, Indians are still here and they're fighting back and taking ownership and revitalizing. And so the survivor stories are just so, so critical. And I just really, really want to encourage that, you know, if we want to fight the transmission of trauma, we also need to be transmitting the stories of resilience and heroism, and the communication is really important. There's probably a lot of white people here that are also saying, well, what can I do? And so I just want to talk for a moment about being an anti-racist ally, the importance of listening, giving, and just shutting up and being uncomfortable and listening, and then listening some more. Some anti-racist resources I would love to share as well. There's a couple of books. One is How to Be an Anti-Racist. Another one is called The Racial Healing Handbook by Annalise Singh, which is a really, really great story, really has great resources for folks. And then also for, you know, white people, I think exercising cultural humility, and then not engaging in cultural appropriation, supporting Native Indian artists and reading stories by Native authors, you know, like Sherman Alecki, watching films by Native filmmakers, listening to poetry, buying poetry from Native poets. And so we can broaden and make more connections and support healing, and really understand that colonialism and the harms of colonialism also make us blind to a lot of to how colonialism has also benefited a lot of people. And so the active work is a very painful process. We need to have these conversations and create safe spaces to do it. And I just really want to invite people to get uncomfortable and to have these resources. So I saw someone saying, what are the books again? One is called The Racial Healing Handbook by Annalise Singh. And the other is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Abram Kendi. And so those are really, really strongly recommended. So that's what I have to share, Danielle.
I want to thank you so much, Lisa, and to you, Titan, for being a partner with us on this. I would also like to thank the NEA, who does provide support for this program. This program is a part of our current exhibition, Weaving History into Art, The Enduring Legacy of Shan Gosshorn, who is an advocate for so many Indigenous issues and bringing them to light. It has been a privilege and an honor for Gilcrease to host this exhibition and to share it with you guys, and to have an opportunity to talk about those issues in programs like this. So we want to thank you guys for being a part of it. If you are a Gilcrease member, we have a special perk for you. If you are a member of the Gilcrease and purchase the exhibition catalog that goes with the Shan Gosshorn exhibition, you are able to schedule a free personal 1-hour tour with our curator of history, Mark Dolph. You can find more information in your email inbox, or you can contact the museum store, and those details are here on the screen. Now, we do have upcoming programming for the Shan Gosshorn exhibition. The exhibition is still available to be seen at the Gilcrease Museum. You can visit our website, www.gilcrease.org, to reserve your tickets to come see this exhibition. Please remember to follow us on social media or to follow along on our website, where you can get updates about upcoming programs and other information about things going on at the Gilcrease. One of our next programs that's coming up for this is a panel on missing and murdered Indigenous women. Registration is open for that panel. Again, please visit our website, gilcrease.org/events, to sign up for that panel. So I would like to thank everyone who participated with us today, our 3 wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise, your family knowledge, and your personal knowledge. And thank you to the NEA for sponsoring this program. Thank you to TU Titan and Lisa Cromer. And again, thank you to our Curator of Indigenous History and Art, Chelsea Herr, for moderating this panel. We hope that you guys enjoyed it, and we want this to be the beginning of the conversation. So if we go back to the resources page, you're going to see my contact information. If you would like to share any of your stories with us, whether you are a boarding school survivor, a descendant of a boarding school survivor, or maybe just a descendant of someone who worked at a boarding school, please share your story with us. We are looking for other avenues to share and open up discussion about this. So on this slide, you'll see my email. Please reach out to me. Let's get in touch, and let's start the conversation about this issue. Again, we want to thank you guys so much for being a part of this panel and film screening today. And whether it's virtually in person, we look forward to seeing you at the Gilcrease soon. Wado.